To record, you must have 2 or more callers. Well, got an icon that says stop recording. So I'll just assume it's recording since the icon says stop recording at this point. In fact, alright, so let's get going. This is the 3rd session for this overview, kind of introduction to web development for beginners using PHP and MySQL. So what I'm going to do tonight is to do a little bit more on the PHP side of it in terms of the flow, the way the programs flow, the flow control items. There's a couple of little things that are different in PHP, not too much. So since you have some background in the other programming languages, it shouldn't be too difficult to pick it up. But it does have its own world of interesting things that you can do inside of PHP and for program control. We're not going to do anything on object-oriented programming. It's just way beyond the scope of the couple of hours we have, but it can do that as well. And keep in mind, everything has to be loaded on the server side. So if you have a lot of scripts that are all object-oriented and tied together, each one of them has to include the other ones, and so until you really get into robust applications, you can kind of avoid that to a certain extent. But object-oriented is good for big projects with lots of people involved. So we'll just stick with the straight procedural type of application. So that's what we'll do. And then the second half, we'll get into some database. So there we go. So let's get started with this a little bit and get my screen up. So the first thing is we'll look at the if statement, and there's not much different here with the if statement that you would see on any programming languages. So let me just bring this up. So this is just a little example, and it does have PHP and HTML mingled together. So it just kind of simplifies it. And this editor I'm using, I'm not really happy with the syntax highlighting, but it's good enough. So we can hardly see where the PHP starts, but it starts here, and it runs all the way down to here. So that's just the, most of them would be that way. But every once in a while I have a little embedded PHP. So we'll have little sidebars as we go along, because there's so many little interesting things in PHP that you might want to use. For example, we do know about the super global functions, and server is one of them. And it has a variable in it. Again, this is associative array, just like we talked about the last time we met. And PHP_self is the key. And that gives you a document level reference to your document that you're actually in. And then there's a function in PHP called base name. Will strip everything out except the file name. So it's kind of interesting because that'll just show the file name at the top of the screen. So when I'm looking at the screen, I know which file I'm in, but it's just something you might run into. There's a dir name, which gives you the directory to the file. Again, at the document level, so from the root of the web server down to the document. Sometimes you find those kind of handy to work with multiple files. So nothing special here, is just a little bit of candy for myself, but something you can learn by seeing. I'm not too sure about the server functions. Variable will cross it again, and that's a function that's built into PHP. All right, so that's just kind of embedded into the HTML. And then down here, both of you are in that JavaScript class over at Raritan, so we were actually doing some of these similar things here. So what we're doing is we're just rolling some dice using the PHP rand function, which is convenient because it gives you a ability to get a range of numbers just by providing 2 arguments, and we're storing them in variables for the computer, 2 opponents, the computer and theoretically a human. And then we're using, since we're inside of PHP at this point, we use the echo to send back to the web server, or to include it in the document. Actually, automatically everything's echoed that's not inside of PHP. And then if you're inside of PHP, you have to add to it, and echo is one of the commands you can use. And so we're just simply concatenating some text and outputting this. All right, so the key item is the if statement. There's nothing special compared to JavaScript or more common programming language. There's if, there's the parentheses to put the logic expression inside of it, and then curly braces, and you can put those on different lines depending on what you like to do. And these are just examples of single ifs. So if the logic expression inside, which uses logic operators, it computes to true, then the items inside the first set of blocks, brackets, will be processed. And so this is just a series of them. And they can be done this way, one after another, as long as that's your case, that either the computer wins, the human wins, or there's a tie. And so looking at the three logic expressions, only one of them can ever be true. And so that works this way. So we have some other combinations that you can use in case if the first one has to be true. If that's not true, then the second one, and you go into a sequence so that where two or more expressions could be true, but you want to pick them in a sequence, you can chain them together. So I'll just run this over in the web browser. Oh, and then down at the bottom we can see another use of this. And the screen will refresh a little bit. We'll see the same use of this base name and the current file I'm in. So what I'm doing is just creating a hyperlink back to the same file. So it's taking the actual path to the file, including the file name, and this strips out everything except the file name. All right, so I'll go over and just run this quickly. And we won't spend a lot of time on these, but if you have questions, bump me and I'll stop and see what they are in detail. So this is just this one here, and it runs. You can see here's the file name popping out, and if we look up here on the bar, this is the URL, but also inside of the web server, this is actually the document path, and it's kind of a long one for me, but it goes out forever and ever, and it's a big one. So I have a lot of things on my computer, and so you can see it's almost embarrassing to see them all, but there you go. And so all that base name does is strip all that off and just give you this piece at the end. And you can see it over here in the actual screen. All right, and then we just ran the program, and it says I won, and we can go back and look at the code, but basically it's just one of the if statements fired. And then down here, as I roll over this, and it may not be easily seen, but you can try to look down in the status bar of the web browser, you can see the entire path to the files being repeated. And of course the web browser is actually putting in everything except the file name. If we view the source, you can see this is what was put in by PHP. And I don't know how big that is. It looks pretty big on my iPad, but let me plus it up just a bit. Oh, it won't work inside the toolbar, tool area, so we'll just close that. All right, so that's that one, and let's take a look at a couple others. If statements are pretty straightforward. Let's see what number 2 is. Number 2 is somehow the same as number 1. I actually didn't want to use that one either. I guess I didn't complete as many of these as I had thought. So we'll go back to number 1. I'll just do some modifications to it. So we could also do if, and we can throw in here an else. And it's not necessary in this example because of the way the structure, the logic works, but you do this when you only want one of them to ever process. So in case more than one is possibly true, you could set it up this way. And so we get the same results if we run this. So we have the use of if and else if, and then we also have the capability of just doing else, which we could do. It's always the last one. So it always would be the last one. You can do just a plain else. I think I took too much out there. Yeah, that's an else. Oh yeah, I have to take it more than that. So there would be a case where we're just simply saying that if the first two logic expressions are false, this is the catch-all for all three of them, for all possibilities. So this is a pretty easy program to see what the logic is going to be. In some cases, you need to do that. So we have some of these variations. So a little bit on flow control. So that's just basically the if statement, and there's not much more to know about that other than what you would learn in every other programming language, including the operators. We have the less than, greater than type operators. So do I have a link to? Here's the link to it. And notice that, and we'll take a look at this link. And this is W3's three schools, and I just happen to like their layout. And they have some good examples for PHP, so if you like that one, it comes up pretty high in the search engines. And so they're not too mean to you when you visit their sites. And so you can see in here, these are the operators that you have for math, and string operators, and increment and decrement operators. These are all for doing data manipulation. And then finally we come down to the comparison operators. And you have the double equals for equals. Most languages have a way for equals and check to make sure they're the same data type. And since PHP is like JavaScript, the data type is a little loose. So you can get into situations where your program is using a function, it's returning a value, you haven't paid much attention to it, and you'll find that some PHP functions, built-in ones, will return true or a text string, or false in a text string, those kinds of things. So they have always had the triple version of the comparison operator for you to use in those cases. And there's also a way to test for the data types if you need to make it more explicit. So these are all the typical logic operators, or they call them comparison operators, and I kind of agree. They compare something on the right and the left, and based on that they compute true or false. Then you have logic operators. Let me just try to get them in focus here. So the ones that are pretty common between all languages are the last three. And they're just using symbols, but at least at this version of PHP they can use these words if you want to make it more readable. So that's up to you. But these first three and the last three are identical operators. So we can use those in our logic expressions for something like the if statement if you need to. Alright, so there's plenty of operators. You can spend all day on them, but I just give you the idea is to have a place to double check to see what the actual supported list is. And so let me just check my time. Alright, so let's move over to looking at some loops. And there is a switch statement as well. I mean, there are all these different types of statements that you can work with for controlling the flow. I'm just going to pick or choose. If you needed to come back to one, I can follow up on it. All right, so here's a loop. The same setup, it's basically the same layout for the HTML, and then we come down here and some echoes just for some readability on the screen. So we're just simply going to repeat a loop for 10 times, and I wrote here 0 to 9. So it's like a lot of the other languages. There's a for statement, and then there's a set of statements inside of the parentheses. And then the first one is the starting value, and you need an index or a counter variable inside. So that could be any name variable that you like to create. So in this case, it's just a variable I. And we're starting it off at 0. And the second argument is an expression for logic that says when the loop will stop. So when that expression is true, the loop repeats. When it becomes false, it stops. And so in this case, when I becomes 10, the loop will stop. And here is the increment expression, and this just tells you how much you want to increment each time through the loop. And this is where you can use some of those shortcut math operators for auto increment. And so it's just simply plus plus means increase by 1. And then you can use the variable inside the loop, the counter variable as you like. Remember, PHP has this interesting way, if it's a double quote, the variables get rendered inside of the expression. If it's a single quote, then they get shown just as they are as text. So it's just a convenience item that was built into the language. And I use it every once in a while just for the fun of it. All right, so I'm going to come over and take a look at that one. Just changing the folder around to where we are. So this is this first one. And so it's simply going through the loop, and each time it's repeating this text and giving you the actual index counter, which is 0 through 9. And so we started at 0 and ended at 9. We can certainly start at 1 and end at 10. It's really up to you how you want to do your counter. So you'll work a lot with arrays, and arrays are indexed with the first position being 0, indexed arrays that is. So this is a common situation where you would start at 0. But you can start at any position, any number, and end at any number. So let's take a look at another example. Okay, this example is also doing is changing the increment operator, just showing you the use of plus equals. So we're supposed to be going by 2's. That's the theory here. So we'll go take a look at this one in the web browser. And so we got it started at 0, and then each time through the loop we incremented it by 2. We never hit 9 because it's the odd number. And so that's basically the use of this operator can be very handy. We can go backwards. So here's an example of minus minus. Just want to see what it looked like as it's projected. It looks like a long dash. So there's 2 minuses in here. And those just means decrease by 1. In this case, we're starting at a higher number, and we're reducing it. And so as long as we're above a number, so in this case above 0. So nothing really different here. I'm going to save demonstrating that. We'll just look at the last one. And then we'll demonstrate both of them. The last one's the same one, except we're going by 2's. So we're decreasing by 2's. So just take a quick look at those two. And so this is just incrementing by, or decrementing by 1's, or just going in a reverse order. And this one is doing the same thing, except we're doing it by 2's. Starting at 9, and we ended up at 1. And so that's pretty basic with a for loop. And it is a specialty loop. It's just built in for specialty. And I'm only going to do for loops tonight because I want to do more on the database side of it. The programming language is something you can spend a lot of time learning. And if you have some ability in there, you'll be able to do a lot of that on your own. So there is a while loop, and there is a do while loop capability inside of PHP, like most languages. And the while loop is really more complicated to work on, but for a counter like this. And then we have some specialty loops. But if I was doing a while loop, I would do while, in this particular example, I would put my expression inside of the while key. The while is just like for, it follows by an expression. Actually, it's more like the if statement. It's a logic expression that follows it. And we'd repeat that loop while I is greater than or equals to 0. In fact, I'll change this just to make it a different variable. And so I2 in this case. And so this loop would go on forever, or it might crash. I'm not sure because we haven't defined that variable. So normally you would just define the variable. So while it's greater than 0, and so we might set it to 10. And then inside the loop we would manually manipulate the variable. In this case, just to subtract 1. And we'll change this so it displays the right. So while is actually the master loop. You can do anything in while. For is a specialty loop. So you use that because it's conveniently built for going through arrays traditionally. So I think this will work. This is ad lib, you never know. And so this was number 4, so let's go over and take a look at that. And so we have an error, so once we get used to these errors, I expected a single quote, and we have to go on line 22, and that's the name of the file. So that's not helping any more than that. So line 22, I forgot the $sign in front of the variable, which is easy to do when you're going between different languages. Okay, that's pretty good. Like that one. And let's see if we got any more. All right, so it's I should have put a little break in there, but here it is right here. This is the while loop. So it looks just like the for loop going in reverse by ones. And so come back and take a look at that just so you can think about it. A little more dangerous in some cases, because if you have that expression and you haven't tested that expression out well enough and it never becomes false, you can really lock up your server. So just a warning ahead of time on that one. And so just be careful. You test the expression. What you do when the server seems to be locked up, your only choice is to go to your control panel and shut it down. If you're on a public hosting service, I don't know if they do it automatically, but at some point in time you're going to get it shut down, and you're going to get a warning that you might get fired. They might throw you out of their service company. So check these things out. Loops can be really dangerous. Also in JavaScript, it can tie the web browser right down to the point the user can't use it. All right, so that's a while loop. I didn't have a lot of examples of it. I just wanted to show you that one. All right, now the big item is moving through arrays, so let's take a look at that. So this one is set up similar to the last one. We have an array being created, an indexed array. So it's just simply 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 indexes, and we're just putting all the states that begin with new in it. And the arrays, in arrays, we have a function called count. So there's not a dot length, which you'll find in other languages for arrays. It's a function built into PHP called count, which will give us the number of elements in an array. And I'm storing it in a variable just so we don't keep calling it. If you're calling somebody else's function, you're obviously running some code each time. So this way we just store the data. So that's just an efficiency item. So right here is where it's being used. So we could certainly put this there as well. This particular function count could be put into that expression. All right, so this is again a counter starting at 0, and it continues until we are just below the length of the states, and we're incrementing by 1. I guess I put a whole bunch of them in here to make this harder. So the second one is doing the same thing. It's just, okay, so inside of the loop you often use the counter variable. So in this case we're displaying it. In this case we're pulling something from the actual array. So we're going to array position. In the second one, we're doing the same thing, except we really want to see the counter variable, instead of starting at 0, start at 1. So we need to start at 0 for the array, because arrays start at 0. The index does. So this index position starts at 0, so this is a perfect counter for it. But we really wanted to show on the screen starting from 1. So this is a programmer item here. It has nothing to do with PHP. It's just a way of doing something. And down here, this is just using PHP to actually create a unordered list. So inside the loop, we just keep repeating li tags and throwing in whatever we have in the array. And the last one is the same one, except actually the first one was an unordered list, the second one's an ordered list. So the variations are not too big. So let's go take a look at that one. Get it set up first. All right. So this is just a for loop, and we're showing the counter here, I, which is just 0 through 3, and we're going for the length of the array, which is 4. And so if you have any questions, any thoughts about that in terms of learning arrays, we mentioned last class they're always counted for the number of items there are, but they start at 0. It throws most people off at the beginning. This is the same one, except we just decided to make it look a little easier for somebody reading it to add 1 to the counter as we went through the loop. But if the loop works identical, we're just modifying the output. And this one we just simply decided to use li tags all the way through. And this one we decided to use ol tags all the way through. And if we view that in a page view, and it didn't come out neatly because, let's see, there is a way. Because I didn't plan for that, which is a good point anyway to bring that up. Let's go down here a little further. So there is the actual, so what I did is in my tool, the actual inspector tool or the web developer tool, you can see things either in source code mode, which is the original source code that was received by the web browser, or how it was rendered in the entire DOM tree. So that's what we're actually looking at. And this version of Safari has a little toggle on it. And so now we can actually see what Safari actually is rendering on the screen versus what we sent it, which is the same, but sometimes it's different. So you can just see all it did was put in the LI tags as we went through the loop, and the same thing with the OL. Nothing really different here except the actual tag OL. So if we go back to the source code, you'll notice that it's almost unreadable, because if you're outputting for you to read the source code, you're going to have to put in line feeds into your HTML, your PHP in the HTML. So that's sometimes something you need to do, so let's just show you how to do that. I didn't really plan on it, but it came up. So right here I'd like to have, this is outputting but it's not giving me a line feed. That's the thing. So automatically we get a line feed up here. That's just the way the server works. There actually is a line feed in here. You just don't see it. I mean, there's no character to see it, but it's in here. So here we're just sending some text, but we never send a line feed. Okay, that's just a 730 warning. So this is the line feed. So if you want to actually put a line feed in for your viewing ability to see it in the other side, you'll have to put it in, and it's a \n, and I forget, let's see, if I put it inside of here, does it get interpreted? I always get a little bit of dyslexia on this. It's \n is the line feed character, and let me just put that in. Let me see. And that was correct. I think if you put it inside a single quotes, it gets interpreted as a \. That's right. It's multiple languages. Which one does it which way? So you have to stop and think for a second. So you could have used single quotes, in which case you run into an issue there. So now you can see there's little line feeds behind all these LI tags. It just makes it more readable for you. It doesn't help anybody else out. So you might find that as an issue when you're trying to do some debugging work and you're looking at the source code on the other side and you're wondering what happened here. So again, if you've had single quotes here, everything would be interpreted as is. And you might see some programmers have some variable like NL equals, and I put that in kind of wrongly, at some point where it's globally accessible to the entire set of PHP scripts. And they just put that in, get the slash in correctly, at the end of everything, any line that they output. And then they get more fancy with programs, sub-programs that might do this for them. But so you might see some things like that where there's a new line variable at the end of every one of the echo lines. And the only reason they do that is they can do this when they go to production. And then everything they output is one big long line. I wouldn't worry about bothering with that anymore. In the old days, that was kind of cool. Now we have these tools that show you the actual rendered HTML, and in which case they're going to be able to see the HTML very easily. So it's a waste of your time, waste of the processor's time, but you might see it in some old code. I used to do it as well. All right, so that's something on loops through an indexed array. And then the other one is arrays with keys. So this is the stocks array that we looked at last meeting that I created, which is a key array. So there's a key, and then there is this funny looking symbol, an equals and a greater than, and then the value. So key name value. And we might have mentioned, just as a review, that you can look at it as on a separate line instead. You could do stocks, and then you would put in the key, ABC stock, who knows what that is, equals to 1, 2, 3. Right, so inside of the array function, which creates a new array, that's how you initialize an array. You're either going to have a list of values, or you can have a series of key pairs and more. I mean, you can have arrays inside of arrays inside of arrays on the creation side of it. But basically, just to bring you back up to speed, in case you've forgotten this from last time. And also, it's unique in the way PHP kind of does this. So it's not ununique to programming languages to have a named key, which is, we call them associative arrays in some cases. And I commented out a quick way we can dump it. And we did that last class. Okay, so here's some loops. So we have a for each, which you'll probably use. For each gives you the ability to go through a named array. And one level. If you want to go to multiple levels, believe me, there are functions within PHP to drill down into a nested set of key named arrays and pull all the data out. They're there, and once you get into that depth, you're really doing some heavy-duty data manipulation. So this is a common one because often you have a simple array with a series of keys. So the array name, this keyword as, a variable to represent the key inside the loop, and a variable to represent the value inside the loop. And that's as simple as that. And then you can use those two inside the loop. And I threw in this example some sorting functions. Actually, there's a sort, S-O-R-T function just for arrays in general, which you can use on index arrays. And then they have some special ones for these key named arrays. There's ksort, which sorts on the key. There's krsort, which does reverse order. So this would be ascending, descending. There's one asort, which is on the value, and then an arsort, which is on the value in reverse. And other than the sort function coming up, the loops are all the same. You're just looping through the array and showing the key and the value. The other thing to realize is, although this looks like the order to the data, when you're looking at it, it's not necessarily guaranteed in an associative array that the data will appear in the order that you have added it. That's commonly thought of as a norm. So I'll just go output to the screen on this one for you. Here you go. And so this is a list directly from the array without any sorting. And it actually appears in the order that they were added. This is you're running the ksort, so you can see the alphabetic listing of the keys, of the key names. And then the krsort, they're just reversed. And then the asort, you can see the numbers are ascending, and then arsort descending. So I thought you might be interested in that. Associative arrays have quite a few functions. And do I have a link for that? Yes. So I'll bring that screen up just as soon as I get there. And it looks, I noticed this week they came out with their new UI, which is really, I think it's better so far, the UI for PHP, and a little bit better in the way they organize some of the content, although it's very similar to the old layout. So I've apparently seen the latest UI. I don't know if everybody is, but this is just a link. And normally I find these just by typing in what I'm looking for, the word PHP, and this .NET website comes up usually in the top 10, most of the time in the top 1 or 2 for whatever you're looking for, as long as you use one of the words. So you can see there's a myriad of array functions. Shuffle is an interesting one. It will shuffle your indexed array like shuffling a deck of cards. So if you create an array with 52 items in it for a deck of cards, and you gave each array position something to identify which card it was in, you could use shuffle to shuffle the array. All right, so anyway, just to point out to you that there are things. You can search an array to see if a key exists very fast. So we're going to look at functions in a second, and if you create a function, you can pass the key to the function, and the function can look in the array for you. These are all built into it. And there's more than you'll ever need, and so just so you're aware, it's a lot of them. Explode and implode you might find useful, and some of these up here that says see also. Explode and implode. Explode explodes I think it's a string into an array, and implode goes the other direction. We're not going to demonstrate those, but let me just double check to see. The explode, here's a list of text. We're exploding it by the space. This is the array coming in, and then we get a whole indexed array of all the parts. So you'll find that very handy, especially if you're compacting data in a database and you're separating it with some kind of delimiter. You're sending data to your PHP from a web page, and you have it compacted, and implode goes the opposite direction. So I think you'll find those probably useful. So implode takes the array and creates a string. And so what we have is an array full of names or words. We're going to concatenate them together with commas. So they're kind of interesting. A little sidebar on arrays from last time I met. All right, so let's look at functions. And so I'll go back to the code window. So functions are like other programming languages, and at the current state of PHP we can do functions inside of functions like we can do in JavaScript, and we can call functions by their name, although there are a lot of differences still in that area, just so you're aware. But in the general area of functions we have all the same setup. So this is an example of a function. It's a keyword function. It has a name. It has parentheses. Arguments are optional. You have curly braces. You can put them on separate lines like I did there, or follow a similar way all the way through your examples and put it on the line like that. And then there's a closed curly brace as well. So what does this function do? It doesn't do anything until we call it. And here's an example of how you call it. And so when you do call the function, you don't have to pass it any arguments, and it does something. We don't know what it does, but it does something. So we go look inside, and we see it's just adding more echo output. But a function might write something to the database. The function might write something to your hard drive on your server. Your function may do things that are not visible to the program, but they're doing something in the background. And in this case, it's actually doing some echoes. Here, it's just simply looping through the stock associative array and outputting it. But what's interesting here is also to see with functions, we do have scoping of variables. So this variable here becomes part of the global space. In fact, there is a super variable called $globals, all caps, which includes that variable as a key name. Dollar global, open square bracket, double quotes or single quotes, the word stocks. So it doesn't really matter whether you use the global super variable or the actual variable itself. That's global. It's not inside of any other function. Now, inside of the function, if you want to use the globals, you have to specifically import them, and that's how you do it. Or, you'll see in the next example, we can pass them as an argument. So this is just showing you the scoping, how scoping works. These variables here are only part of the function. They're limited to this function. You can't see them on the outside of it. Not that we want to. All right, so that we can quickly demonstrate. You can see I'm cheap. All right, so let me go back to the pop-up came up for the buy of the product. I don't use this product enough to purchase it. It's good for this particular purpose since it's a little less overhead on the processor. Let me get that in place. And there's not much to see, it's just output. But we called the function and it outputted the data as it was designed to do. And a couple other function examples. So it's expanding on it. Instead of having one array for stocks, we created two arrays. One of them is got a suffix to its name, stocks underscore tech, stocks underscore energy. Let's change that to energy. Oops. Let's change the program and it won't work, right? Oops. Especially when you don't have your hands on the keyboard in the correct place. But since this is going to be part of the final examples, might as well fix it while I'm looking at it. So anyway, there's two variables with two different lists of stocks and their prices, associative arrays. And the show stock portfolio function that we created has been changed to have an argument coming in, and we also got rid of the global variable importing. There's the previous example. And in this example, we now have an argument. And you see there's no data typing involved. We don't say it's a string or an integer. It's very free form, loose. And the variable's being used inside. But this is local. Oh, I'm sorry. This is local. I don't want to yell too loudly to this function. But if you pass arrays, they are passed by reference. Just keep that in mind. So you could end up changing them. And anyway, inside of here we are just doing the loop like we did before. What that gives us the ability is to pass in the data that we want the function to work with. So down here we have the function being called twice. And so that's very typical. The function can receive data but not return any. And let's look at the last one, and then we'll watch them both in the web browser. The last one is kind of a contrived example, but it's good enough. It's basically giving your portfolio's average price per share without considering the number of shares you own. So that's why it's contrived. But it still does what we want to demonstrate. So the function was changed just to represent what it's supposed to do. It says get stock portfolio average price, basically for one share each. And so you pass in the array, the associative array, and it returns something. And so if you look down here where we're using it, we're echoing what it returns. So the function is just simply being... And a function is like any other item in an expression when it returns values. So once a function returns values, or in some languages, and I think maybe PHP, but I have to really think about it, all functions return a value, or all functions return some kind of a state. But normally when it's void, it's not returning something. You shouldn't be using it in an expression. So if the language lets you do that, just be careful. But this one we can see returns a value because it's a return keyword. And you can have different points in the function to return a value, but once the return statement is hit, that's it. There's no more processing in that function. The function terminates. So you can have it earlier in the function, say embedded in an if statement, and then later in the function embedded in another if statement, and maybe at the end of the function. Wherever you hit it first, it ends the function. So it depends on what's going on for your need. And this is just simply looping through the same array, and it's just accumulating the prices, and then in the end we divide the prices by the number of items that were in the array. Come up with some average, which may or may not be meaningful, but it does point out how you can send data into a function and receive data back. And the only example we don't have is one that doesn't receive any data but returns something, like a function that determines whether or not the user is logged in. So we don't pass anything in, but it comes back true or false whether the user is logged in which case the function does all the work of looking up the correct data to see if it's there to verify if the user is logged in or not. So I don't have an example of one that we don't send data into, but we receive it back. But we might run into one by accident somewhere down the road. So we'll take a quick look at these. And they're not really that much for the output. So this is the one we're just passing the arrays into the function. The first array of stocks and the second array of stocks. So works great. And I see a question, so I'll take a focus on it. And the second group. I don't know why I don't hear the chimes. Let me see if there's a feature here. I should be hearing chimes or not. Okay, let's see. Hopefully you can all hear me. Lon, I think we can call, Lon, can we call a function using an HTML link? You can call a PHP program, which in turn has a function in it, yes. And the answer is yes, but you can't just call the function. So there is what we call services for web servers, where you call the service, and there's a whole other protocol involved. And you can do that in PHP. You can design that. So it's possible, but it's not something that's built in. So what you would do is you would call a function, you call a PHP script and send your data to it, and then it would determine what it needs to do next based on the data, and then returns data. It just returns data back. And you can return data back just with one echo statement. So let's suppose your server side simply just returns back true or false depending on what message you send it. Right? So you can send the message, is it hot? And it either comes back true or false. You can send the message, if it's cold, it will come back either true or false. So it just echoes true or false, or a word like true or false. Then you can echo back complex data structures such as JSON or XML and data pairs. So there's all different ways to echo data back. It's a good question because you start to learn a little bit, then you're trying to picture how you're going to use these things. And so you're looking at hybrid examples, which this is a boring screen, so let's go over to the actual code. And you're looking at a hybrid example, but the fact that we're actually sending back screen rendering information is not necessarily a requirement. So a lot of people in PHP world try to create a single entry point script. And this is getting more advanced for what you want to start in the beginning. Keep it simple, don't get too fancy, because then you're burdened by trying to handle everything. If you have a couple extra scripts that have to be called separately in order to solve a problem, do it. But if you get really good at it, you can have one entry point. And you might pass in an operation code, for example, or an action code with every request to that script. And that action code would know whether it should return a web page or it should return data. And then, the other side knows what it's doing. All right, so let's look at, and I might have gone fast, I don't know. Covering control structures could be a whole week's class, so I just try to give you a good overview of where you need to go. And you need to know the if statements. You need to know the switch statement, which I kind of skipped, but it may pop up in something else. You need to know a for loop, and the for each is pretty good to know as well, and understanding those arrays. And functions, that's going to be your basic way of writing code at the beginning. And if you move into object-oriented programming, they're called methods, and the structure of the code files is quite different. So we'll look at some ways of breaking the code up. So I'm going to switch gears really rapidly here, but we'll still be looking at PHP code and go to databases, so we can use the time as best as possible. So the MySQL database is the one we will look at, and that's the one we're going to spend some time looking at. And I have links. I feel like Jay Leno here. I have a link. Let's see. They have a nice link out here on phpnet. So I'll bring that screen up as soon as it loads. And I'm going over there now. And hold on one second. I want to put my monitor. I'm using the iPad for monitor, and it's got to set it so that it doesn't auto-lock. Okay, one more second. Okay, good. Just want to make sure I'm always broadcasting. There you go. So this is a link. Again, I'll put this in the package of links, but it's in the phpnet website, and they have this, and they just explain 3 MySQL. Call them what you want. Libraries. They call them extensions. They call them APIs. They can call them anything. They're code added into PHP. So whichever way you want to name it, it's just their way of identifying how it's been linked in. So what I want to warn you is there's the original MySQL extensions. So all the functions, and I'm highlighting a few here, just have MySQL in the name. And so they are deprecated. They're pretty much the old way of doing things. You can still use them, even though they're deprecated. They do require you to do a lot of sanitation of data coming in. In other words, you have to prepare the data to make sure it's not there's no hijacks or SQL injection, as they call it. SQL is structured query language, which we'll see in a minute. And so, and that's well documented on the internet. Make sure that if you bring in something from a form, there's ways of checking it. There's adding characters to it, and I don't want to get into the details because it just spends a lot of time when you learn it that way. Now they have the improved version, which reduces some of that problem, and that's the one we'll look at. It's got an I on all the names. So when you're looking at examples on the internet, make sure you're looking at MySQL examples. In fact, when you search with MySQL. I need to delete all the records in my database in MySQL PHP. That's what you're going to put into the search engine. And then they have an object-oriented version of it. All right, so we're not going to go into that. That's just for more sophisticated coding, and that's good too, and that's new in the order of things here. All right, so this is the best one I think to work with because you don't have to worry about understanding object-oriented, but they all work, and it's just a matter of getting used to one of them, and then the other ones come pretty straightforward. Some of the terminologies, I mean, you scratch your head. What do they mean by bind parameters? And you're trying to think, what does that mean? And there's no function involved, but it turns out it's binding the data that's going into the SQL statement for searching, for example. All right, so that's an important link, or important concept to understand. There are other databases. So, do I have this up here? Is it? No. Something's in my way. No, that's not the one. That's not the one. Let's see. I thought I already had this open. Yes, I do. Okay, another window. Let me get over there. All right, and so I'm in Bluehost, which is one of the hosting companies that you could rent from. Like, there's several of them. I forget, HostGator is another popular one. And so most of them provide other databases, and usually the only other one is PostgreSQL. So you might run into that. Some people did prefer that, and you normally have to have that installed, so it's not always included in the installation package. Neither would PHP necessarily, or I'm sorry, MySQL necessarily be installed, but it's commonplace to have it included, the popularity of it. And so they're both good, just so you know. And so this one, if you want to do it locally, I don't think it comes with XAMPP, but if it does, I've never bothered to look, but I don't think it does. I think you have to add it. All right, so just keep that in mind. And then the other thing is, let's go to the database itself. So if you have XAMPP, get myself over here. Use the mouse correctly, I can switch windows faster. All right, so if you have your local host web browser, or local host web server, and you're using one of them, they might have a control panel for you, but most of them come with phpMyAdmin, or you download it. It's just a bunch of PHP scripts. In fact, you want to learn a lot of PHP, take one of these libraries and start digging through it. So this one just happens to be in this HTML control panel, and I'll just open it up. And believe it or not, this is a button right here. You just would never know it. I've been confused sometimes for days why the side panel disappears, and you just click right there, and it just goes back and forth. So anyway, it's a UI way of maintaining your databases. So MySQL is the database engine. It's basically controlling your databases, of which you can more than one. And so here's a whole bunch of them that are on this local machine, and you can add them right here. You go to databases and just create one. If you're out on Bluehost, I'm going to bring the Bluehost window in here. Hold on, let me just drag it. That's a convenient way to do it that way. Bluehost won't let you do that through phpAdmin. You'll have to go to an icon. In fact, all the web hosting companies, because of the security issues, they have their own interface for you to create the database, and then you'll have to assign access to them and give passwords out. So we'll take a quick look at that. Don't write any of my passwords down. All right, so these are a bunch of databases that are out on one of the websites that I have. All right, so there's just the names of the databases up here. And often they will prefix them with your user login ID. Even though you called it this, they'll call it with this. And down here is where do you create the database? Up here. So you put the name in, you can see it's going to pre-append it. And then down here you'll have to create some users to the database and assign them, because you're going to need those in order to log into the database through PHP. So this is where you're actually going to get the information to log into your database in PHP. And you're going to create it actually on a server. On your local host server, it's a lot easier. Right, so, and then they tell you that you'll be able to use localhost with your own PHP scripts as far as connecting to the database. But if you want to connect to it from another server, they indicate that you can actually do that. So in theory, you could be running on abc.com on HostGator and theoretically get over to Bluehost's database. I wonder, I haven't tried it, because of security issues that they run into, sometimes they prevent it, but theoretically the database runs on its own. It has nothing to do with the website. All right, so there's a host name for it. This is the host name that's been assigned to my databases, but if I'm running it within my own web pages, I can use localhost because I'm theoretically a user on the server when I log in, when I actually there. My PHP is theoretically a user. It's actually got assigned rights. All right, so that's something you have to deal with for public shared hosting companies. And if you're running your own server, then you're way beyond this course. You shouldn't be in it. But in that case, you do just what you're doing with localhost. All right, so in localhost, we can just use PHP myadmin. Whereas if we go back to Bluehost, if we go to the PHP admin, we'll see the same screen minus the ability to add a database. It won't let us add one there. We can do everything else but add one. All right, so once you've added it, then you can create tables, which are just, and I don't want to go too far into explaining what a database is, but this is a table. It has column names and rows, which are called records. And this is actually one I'm building a course on encrypting passwords. And so this is my actual test file. All right, so I'm going to create a database real quick here just so you can see it happen, because you just get PHP and navigate here. We'll just call this learn. And that's the 8 o'clock warning. All right, so there's my database. And it has nothing in it. So now I can create tables. So I'll just create a table called test, say how many columns I want, 4, and hit go. And then I'm faced with filling out this screen. And so we're not going to go into the details of how to create a database, but basically you have to give the simple things you bring back is they have a name for each field, a data type, and there's a lot of choices here for optimizing the database. If it's string, usually there's a length. And then you'll have whether it's auto increment or not, that'll be a big item you look at. Whether it's a secondary index, we'll see in our example we have one of those. And if it's a number, sometimes you want to save some space in the database. If it's an integer, you can choose unsigned. That'll squeeze the database down a little bit since you're only going to have integers or positive. But other than that, the rest of them are for you to look at in detail. So we're not going to go into the filling out one of these screens. But let's go take a look at another way you'll do it. You can, in a database, you actually run SQL. So we don't have any, let's see, where are we here? SQL. So we have to, I think we have to, do we have to create the table first, or can we go back here? Okay, so we went back to the database and clicked on SQL. And we can run SQL commands. So one of the SQL commands can create a table. So I already have built that. So I'm going to go take a look at it. And you'll want to do this yourself too. I wish I knew why that mouse wants to fight me. Alright, so I have some examples here, and let's take a look at what we got. I made the names too long, so I can't follow them. So here it is. Okay. So this is SQL. And the first line, number 1, is drop table if exists guests. So if I run that in the SQL to the database. Now, you can run your database commands at the command line prompt on your local computer. So all PHP admin is giving you the ability to run them there. And you can issue them from PHP, which is what you want to learn about. So we could actually create this command in PHP and have it run from there. Ordinarily, you wouldn't do this one. This one you might just want to do manually. And so then it says create a table if it doesn't exist. Otherwise, if it exists, don't create it, which means it would destroy it. And there's the name. And these are my fields. This is a guest key field. It's just the name of the field. It's an integer, 10 characters. It's unsigned, never have a negative number. You're not allowed to have nulls in it. Always got to have a value. And auto increment it every time somebody adds a record. Guest email is a varchar, means a variable character field. 25, and you'll want to be studying what's the difference between a variable character field, a text field. There's all these different choices. Varchar is the general fallback. and you got to have a value in the guest email. There's a primary key, that's guest key, so it considers that the main key. In other words, there's only one of those, and it's used for linking to other tables if you have to. I created a secondary key on guest email so that it would be unique, so you can't put two emails in. So basically this is a list of guests. Then this would be chosen when you're actually filling out the screen. And it gives you the ability to do transactions. There's another one called My ISAM. So you'll study some of those. So it's either probably going to be My ISAM, in which case you're not worried about heavy-duty transaction processing. That's where you want to do several commands at the same time but have a rollback capability in case one of them fails. So INNODB will do that for you. And at one time it was a little overhead, now no one thinks about it. And some of these other ones are automatically put in. I'm going to show you how I got this out. But here's the key one, auto increment. I'm going to start at 1. Alright, so I'm going to take this SQL and I'm going to go over to the PHP MyAdmin. So the drag thing. Alright, and then I'll just paste it into this SQL command and then do go. And it shows me that I want to drop a table, so it's a built-in warning that my PHP admin has. And it comes back with a report. And it's, generally, if it doesn't show a lot of error messages, you're good. Come over to the first column, says structure. There's my table. It's been built. And if I click on it, it shows me it has no rows. I can look at the structure. There's my first field, guest key, integer 10, and some of the values I picked. Now, you're going to build the database probably through a user interface like the PHP admin. It's easier. Then when you get it, you want to export the structure and store it in a file. So we go to export and go to custom. The reason you want to go to custom is so you can download it to a file, but then you'll be searching all over your hard drive for this darn thing. So I just output it as text, and unless you have a huge, gigantic thing that you're outputting, which include the data, just output it as, to your viewer. So that's why I usually choose custom. And if the second choice you want to look at is whether you want structure and data or just structure. So that'll be up to you. And also, do you want to add a drop table statement at the beginning of any tables you have? All right, so I'll throw that in there. And I hit go. And that's the same thing I just pasted in. And so I would do is store that in a text file in my project, so in case I want to rebuild the database, I can do it quickly without having a lot of thought behind it. And then you got to maintain that, because if you start modifying the database through the user interface, you have to come back and update that. So you have to export it every time you do the modifications. Alright, so now the next thing we'll look at is adding some data. So you can do that certainly through here. They have an insert command, and you can insert data. Now, the auto increment field, you can put a value in, but it will do it automatically. The guest email field will just say a@a.com. And I can put in more than one, hit go, and browse it. And there's my first record right here. Not a big deal here. Auto incremented it by 1, and there's the record. If I insert another one, and I use the same email address, go. My PHP admin is pretty mad at us because it got an error code back from MySQL database saying that there's one in that column, and I made that column unique. You can't have two of the same email address. Now, we don't want our PHP script blowing up because of this, so we need to check for these things. All right. So creating a database. So what I did here, I'm going to go over to the, I don't want to put a lot of data in because it takes so much time. So after I get some data in, I normally will have an insert into. Now you'll notice I have a replace into. So there's two SQL commands. One, insert into, which you have the field names, the name of the table, which is guests, a list of the field names inside of parentheses, the keyword value, and then a list of the values for each one of those records. So there you can see the example there. We're inserting just two fields. There's only two fields. It's too easy to even think about it. And then the keyword values. Now there's a little word wrap here. It doesn't have to be word wrapped that way. It's just the way it's looking. And I'm just going to generate. So I use replace because this is for me to test. every once in a while I'm going to clean up my data and start fresh on my testing. So I copy this. So just replace all these. And if I have more records in, it won't do anything to those. So I might want to actually delete all the records. It depends on how you want to do that, but I would like to just show you. You come back to your database. Again, you go to the actual database, and then to the table, then to the SQL. And this will work actually on any table because it's in the same database, but we usually like to be in the right place so I don't get confused. And if I go back and browse, you can now see I have a whole bunch of records in my database. All right, so that's just a little getting started stuff. I got to get myself started, and I have a lot of steps to go through. So the database should be already running with XAMPP. You set up, ready to go. You open up my PHP admin, or PHP my admin, I mean, and you simply create a database, and then create a table, and then you might want to take a look at the documentation. I don't have a link for that, but I'll get one for you, where you can look at the common fields. But generally, that's where you start. And then do an export of the structure of the table so you can use it again. So you don't have to think through all those steps. And this will be some practice. This is actually a whole learning curve. Databases, SQL, it's a big learning curve. Not one to panic on, it's just one you have to look at that differently, because nothing to do with programming at this point. And we're just trying to get a database running and give it SQL statements, which we want to learn. And then there's a lot of utilities here to help you manage the database and work with it. So you'll learn them as you need them. All right, now what we want to do is pull the data in PHP. So let's go start looking at that. So we have a database, we have a host, it's called localhost. Different from localhost for your web server, we have a database server called localhost. And we have a database called learn, and we have a table called guests. All right, so let's go back to our code window. I gotta get that, and then in the code window we want to take a look at our first MySQL. Click on the right one. All right, so I want to highlight just this one line, because the other lines in here are just for outputting a lot of information so we can see what's going on. So let me explain that first. I created an array called log, and I just keep appending messages to it. And then at the end I dump it on the screen. It's kind of one of my techniques. For when I'm working, I just need a way to get, and I don't want to have a lot of echo statements all over the place. This is easy to get rid of it, just delete the last line, comment the last line. So it's one of my techniques for logging. There's built-in logging to PHP, but I won't get into all that. It's all ways of logging. It's just my shortcut personal way. So we can ignore all those lines. Let's look at this line. This line here is actually creating a connection to the database. The host name, the username, the password. So when we're back on Bluehost, you will be setting up a username and a password. And you can use localhost. Your PHP scripts will be running from your own web server where you have the account. And then the name of the database. All right, so if you're putting this up onto the actual server, you're going to have to change these two items. This you can leave the same. And it's actually object-oriented, so you're going to see new, and then it's calling this function and creating this, and then assigning it to a variable. The @ sign is a shortcut way of suppressing error messages in PHP. So if we leave that out or leave it in, it works the same, except if it fails. Let's leave it out. All right. Then we have a way of testing to see if it succeeded or not. So there's a function to see if the connection had an error. And then you can dump those errors out, study them. For a lot of applications, you may not bother. But keep in mind, if the database crashes, the user's in for a surprise unless you're handling it. All right, so you just need to figure how many tests you want to run, because everything can fail, from connecting to the database to querying it. There's just many failures, and every one of them is going to need a test to see what's going on. So in these examples I'm putting up, I'm actually going to minimize the test except for this one. So if it's, here's our if statement. So if it could be set equals to true if you like. But if you have something that returns true or false, by logic it's either true or false. That's the expression. All right, so that's all that is. And what we're going to do is run this, and now we're going to have some fun. As soon as I figure out which one it was, what was it called? It was test MySQL. How come I don't see it? Oh, here it is at the bottom. All right, so that's the one we just ran. And so I use some other functions also. This one gives me the version in a number format. This one gives me the version in a descriptive format with lots of other information. So these are some info functions that are built into PHP. These are PHP functions that are part of the PHP running on your web server because MySQL has been installed into it. Little message myself, and then this is the same information that's coming back, only using the fact that I can actually refer to this. I didn't explain this in a lot of detail. Associative arrays, you can reference the key items with this dash greater than. So actually what it's doing, MySQL is a associative array. So if we dumped it, we should probably dump it, we would see it. It's just a big array with all these keys in it, and maybe sub levels too. All right, so that's just to give you an example. I'm going to go break it. I'm going to stay on this window, but what I'm going to do is go back and I'm going to change it from root, the username root, to rot, and then I'll refresh this. All right, so I'm denied. So you can see MySQL actually breaks through and throws me an error message. So that's what the little @ sign was, to prevent that from coming out. It's the last thing I want to see on a production site. So I throw that in because it's standard operating procedure. But more importantly, here's my code handling it. So you need the @ sign to suppress this darn thing. There's other ways to suppress it too, but the @ sign is guaranteed. You can see it in the code. There is error handling functions in PHP. Normally, they're set up on a public server so they won't come out. But you can't guarantee that, some night some web administrator might turn them off by accident for an hour. Not that anybody's going to see it if it's not coming up, but there you go. So it's giving me a little information. But down here, this is actually my if test and a little message, and then I'm actually have access to the error codes and error messages through these two properties. These are keys, so to speak. All right, so now I'm going to go and fix that, but I'll put in a different database name. Instead of learn, I'll put in larn. So I can't find database larn. And so it goes to show you that the other possibility of this failing, the database is down. All right, so you need to test for it. All right, so that's your first example. Come back over here to the code. So basically we're just simply getting a reference connection, and you name it whatever you like. Most people name it this, so I do. And so this information just has to be correct. On your local machine, it's root. In fact, you might see some warnings when you install a local version of your web hosting software. Oh, you should make sure you secure your database. And yes, if you're going to let people access it, but if you're only going to access it on your machine, you're pretty good to leave it that way. And then you want to test to see if it worked. And then you'll do all your programming in here to go and update the database, search the database, and do whatever you need to do. All right, so let's take a look at one of those real quick. Okay, so this example, I took out a lot of the testing to see if this thing works. The connecting the database. This one will fail miserably if the database connection fails. The whole thing just comes to an end. So I'm not testing for it, just to simplify. The next thing you need is an SQL statement. Now I break them up into separate lines so that they're not one big long line. But what this really is in one line is select, capitalization is optional, but generally you're going to follow the keywords, all fields from the table guests, and that's it. That's the SQL statement. And normally then with a semicolon, even if they're not required. So I like to break them up into several lines. And so what all this is putting it into a variable called query, optional name, equals on the first one, and dot equals is the same thing as plus equals in JavaScript and other languages. So we're just making this big long string here. Now there might seem to be overkill for this particular SQL statement, but they can get really long. And so when they're one big long wrapped line, for me I get a little dizzy looking at them. So I like to break them up. All right, and again, I'm using this little logging feature so we can actually see what it looks like. All right, so what we do is we work with what they call prepared statements in MySQLi. So a lot of this is being shown to you as template, learn by template, and understand what the template is. So the first thing we do is prepare the SQL statement. So you pass the SQL statement to this prepare method for your connection. And it returns an object that you can then execute queries on. You can pass it data and get data back from it. So it looks a little confusing when you first see it, but each one of them follows the same pattern. So for selects, what you generally do next is you either, it's not here, but you will have a bind statement. I'll show you an example of that one in a minute, where you might bind variables that are coming in. There's none coming into the SQL statement. That's where you get the injection of malicious code when data is passed to the SQL statement. So there's a way to pass it to a prepared SQL statement. And then what you want to see coming out. So we have two variables coming out. And even though it's an asterisk there, I know the database has two fields. So you're going to need something to represent each one. So what's actually happening here is it's going to give you the ability to go through the records one at a time, rather than giving you a whole pile of records. Let's suppose there's 1 billion records. You don't want that pouring into the computer's memory. So what it's giving you is a way to reference each record by a variable name. It's binding this variable to the actual executed SQL statement, and then you can go fetch them, and that's what you see down here, the first while statement. All right, so let me go through that again. Number one, connect. Number two, you don't see, is bind any variables coming into the SQL statement. There aren't any coming in. Execute it. You really should test to see if this fails or not, especially if your SQL statement hasn't been tested. But if it's been tested 100 times, you probably won't. Bind the result. This is basically this will always work every time, but again, you might want to test for it. It's up to you to how much you want to test. There's a possibility these things could be somehow variable in some way, but generally they're pretty hardwired. Then you fetch each record. That's it. Also, you want to close it, especially if you have another. Only need this if you're going to run another one. Another SQL statement. You got to close the one that you have, or create another one. All right, so we'll just go see this. When run it, it's pretty straightforward when you see it run. That would be select all. So most of this was hardwired in as a template, and we're just inserting the data as we go through the database records. And this is my little logging guide down here showing out. There's only one item in it, and there's the SQL statement. If I take this SQL statement, copy it, and go over to my PHP MyAdmin, and go to SQL, and paste it in, it runs. So that's really kind of the essentials. We have a little more time. I'll throw a couple other in, and I'll let the question and answer flow over. But that's just basically give it a quick overview to what you're going to have to go through getting yourself set up. One, make sure that you actually have the database running on your server. And so for the local server for XAMPP, you just simply got to go to the control panel and choose PHP MyAdmin. Also, you got to get it started. Don't forget to turn it on. They have an application utility for that. So it's either a command line to turn it on or off, or not. And this is also where you'll test for the ultimate failure. how well does your code work if this database goes down? You just turn it off here and go run your code. And if the user's seeing a horrible experience, you got to fix all that stuff up. And so it's a good way to test it. So they have this little utility with this one, but there is command lines to do it if you want to just issue them from the command lines. I'm going to close this. Alright, and so that would be the first step, is to make sure that it's running and also be able to access it through some kind of user interface. So that didn't go as well as I hoped. Just try to get over that screen. So the PHP MyAdmin is good as any. There are other ones, and that one just comes along, and you start learning how to use this one, you get used to it, and you won't want to use the other ones. But somewhere along the line, there's actually one put out by Oracle, who now controls MySQL. They actually have their own version, much more robust, but this one is fine. So you have to get used to that. Creating databases is a good place to practice and learn SQL statements. Definitely do that if you need to learn that. This is a place you don't have to go any PHP, just do it here. This will actually create some PHP code for you. I haven't used this in years. But you see this option over here, so I think if you click on this, it'll do something. I don't know where it went. It'll pop out to some other panel somewhere, or blocked. Oh, there you go. Threw in a couple more keywords. Definitely, if you're selecting from a billion records, you don't want all billion of them. That's the MySQL database is going to have to do that work. So they have this limit capability. So you can limit starting and ending. All right, that's learning SQL. All right, so let's see. Step one is make sure you have database running on your web server. You have an access to it, and you have some kind of tool to work with it. You get those in place. Make sure they're there because they're going to be essential to work. And then in PHP, I'm going to make you dizzy. Go back over here, and you can check in the PHP info. That's a function. You can write a one-line PHP script with this in it. And you can go through here and see which supports you have. And this is actually the command line options. You might see it in there, but if you go further down, you'll see the all of them. We don't have time to keep going through all 67 matches. See, we got to cut through a few. So here's regular MySQL. There's MySQLi. And if we go far enough, we'll see the PDO version of it. So that's also you want to check out and make sure you're supported. That comes first before you do anything. Then in PHP, you're probably going to want a little test program that just makes sure that it runs. You can see all the information about it. So this could be a good example to use. So it's just testing to see if all the login works. Once you know all that's working, then you can use those same lines in another piece of code. All right, and then finally, we only had a chance to get to one select. I'll do one more, and then we've used our time up. But basically, using this version of MySQL, MySQLi, you get the connection, and that will be a variable that you get. And $sign will be in front of it. You name it whatever you like. Then you create a query. In this case, it's a select query. It's a little easier than insert queries and update queries. They're not harder in any other sense, that a little bit different syntax, but more so finding out what happened. For example, an update query will return a positive result, but not update anything. You have to interrogate a little further to see if a field was actually changed. So I have some examples, but the time wasn't here to get to them all. So we have an SQL statement which can be tested in your tool. Then you pass that SQL statement to the prepare method, and it returns you a MySQL statement object for you to work with. And the first thing you do is execute it There's one possibility before that called bind parameters, but we haven't seen an example. In a second we will. And then you bind some variables to what you're expecting back. So you have to know what you're expecting back. If I was only expecting back one thing, I can't spell, but guest, what was it called, email? If that's all I was going to get out of the select query, then I would want to modify this to match that. Well, it's one of the error messages you'll get. It does not match. You gotta realize that this thing is helping sanitize some of the possibilities of injections that are coming through it, the MySQLi. Then you execute it, that'll give you a true or false result. So if you have a failure here, you can, the failure is going to be because the SQL statement's got some weird programming to it, where you have code that says, well, in some cases it will be from one field, in other cases it will be from two fields, and you've written some really weird programming. And so when we get down to here, the program is failing because of you. But still, some people test for this one. And then you bind the result, and then you loop through it. So that's a simple example. Let's take a look at one more of these, and then we'll... Well, this one, there's not a big growth on this one. It's just adding in the order by. That's all that one does. So it's just sorting it by a field. And this will give you some growth. Okay, so this one, everything is the same. We are loading in we're connecting the database. We have somebody we want to look up. So this is coming from the form, so to speak. Here it's just wired in. So we're going to be looking this guy up. And the SQL statement is the same as the last one, until we get to this word where, and we have guest email equals, and we have this question mark thing here. And this is where really we get the benefit from this improved MySQL, is that we're going to give the MySQL the data, and it's going to take care of making sure that it hasn't been tampered with. And that's a nice part of it. So we have to put a marker in. So you can't test this SQL statement in my PHP admin, because it will understand this. You're going to have to create a real SQL statement which would look something like this. You probably use a variable, but this is the way it would really look. In the old MySQL, that's how it would look. And that you can take over to your user interface tool and run the query and see if it works. So you have some cases where you might have to actually improvise, because if it's not working, you're going to have to create the query somewhere else and test it. All right, so in this case, and we still have the prepare. In this particular one, for some reason, I'm testing to see if it failed or not. Maybe I did in the last one, I can't remember, but I usually do. And this is the part wasn't in the last one, the bind param. So I'm storing this person I'm looking up in this variable, because I want to pass it as part of the parameters to the SQL statement. And that's why they call it by param. And here's the variable that I'm using to hold the value. And then you have to indicate what kind of data it is. So if you put an S in there, think of it this way. It's going to put quotation marks around it. If you put an I in there, it's going to assume it's a number. And I think there's only one other choice. I forget. There's SI and one other one. And then it executes it just like before. We're asking for 2 items to come back. So we have a field for each one, and we're just looping just like before in a fetch. So the difference between the first example and the second example is we're passing data into the query. Whereas the first example, we're just getting it back. This one, we're passing some data in. All right, so maybe what we should do is we'll look at having another session, if you guys are interested in it, to round out the database part of it. I don't think we were going to get too far with the 3 nights anyway, but it was just enough to break the ice for everybody so they could see where things are going and or where you could go to learn things, where you should go to learn. So I do have, and I'll put in the package, examples of an insert and examples of a update. Insert, the interesting thing is testing for the error code 1062, duplicate entry. Right? So if you're not testing for it some other way, you're going to get the SQL is going to fail, and you'll have code that breaks, so you have to test for that one. So that's probably what's unique, besides the SQL statement, understanding that. Then we have the bind params, we have the execute. We don't have the fetch. With insert, there's no fetching going on. You're just inserting, and you're getting data back as to what happened. And then update, that's the other one I prepared for you, was, again, the SQL statement, just learning about update. Everything's the same. You're binding some parameters. In this case, I'm binding the old email and new email. This one's just a person's changing their email. Oh, by the way, these are pretty interesting because when you can run these over and over again. Let me demo it in a second. I'm just generating random numbers here. I was going to explain this expression writing here, but I'm just generating random email names and then seeing whether I can insert them or not. And if I can, it will give me an error. It will let them go in. If it can, it will tell me there's a duplicate. So it's kind of an interesting example. This one's updating, actually. It's generating an updated to the name, to the email name, and seeing if it can update it or not. So the other one inserts randomly. So we have time to go into all the details here, but basically, again, there's an execute, but there's no fetching. We're just simply going and looking at some various pieces of information. For example, how many rows were actually updated? You know, if there were no rows updated, then nothing happened. But yet the query worked. It, found the record. It just found the record. What MySQL does, it just says, I found the record. That's it. Success. And same way. All right, so we're coming to the logical end here. I'm going to just run those real quick for you and just show you how to run them. I kind of came across this by accident when I was working on these examples for you. So, for example, here's insert. So if I keep refreshing this, it will keep inserting. Here's guest09@meow.com. Watch, guest12@meow.com. So it's just generating these. And eventually, I get a duplicate. If I go take a look at the database, I'll just drag it in. Hit the browse button. There's all those records I just added. This is not sorted in any way here, so it's not sorted in the order they were added, I should say. And the same thing with the other one. I set it up so what it will do is generate a new email address. The person wants to change their email address was the idea, but rather than me type them in, I'm too lazy, so I generate them by magic. So what it does, it generates one of the email addresses to see if it's there, and then generates a replacement. And you just keep running this, and in some cases you'll get not found, but the important thing here is to see whether you had any affected rows or not. See, so there was no rows affected, even though it might have found this, but the SQL statement works every time. There's no errors. All right, so we don't have time to get into the details of that, but so that the code is there for you. All right, so I know it was a lot in a short period of time, but that was the nature of this. So let's see if you got any questions or some way I can help you out. And so I'm going to look at the chat until I find my headphones here. I think the best way to do it is through chat. All right. Yes, I'm going to post the examples. I'll put them up there. And, if you have any questions on them, you're welcome to email me. And are you guys interested in another round of maybe one or two more at some point?
Yeah, I would be, Lon. I don't know.
Okay. I mean, I'll email you to see if we get at least, doing one, I might as well meet over beers and if we get two, then it's worth kind of doing it. But even if you have one. All right, and maybe we can drum up some other business. Is there anything particular? Would you like to focus more on the PHP programming, the MySQL access, creating PHP pages? I don't know really what to say. But if you think of anything, you can always send me later, but I just asked you today. Okay, good. Well, then we'll do that, and hopefully this will be recorded properly, and I'll put the video up. So if you're totally bored on Thanksgiving Day, you can watch the videos. Otherwise, yeah, I can see that was a good one. But otherwise, hopefully there's a good game on. No problem. I enjoyed it, actually. I appreciate your help in sticking in. I'm glad everything worked out. So I'll let you know. Thanks.
Thanks, Lon.
Thank you.